Firstly, let me begin by thanking all of you for coming here, making it, braving through the chaos in town tonight because of what's going on in AI Summit. I especially want to thank Ambassador Shyam Saran, General Shukla, Ambassador Arun Singh, and Barkha, of course, for coming here and participating in the discussion. What I thought I'll do is really just to make three broad points about the book and the subject. The first point I want to make was really the idea of balance, or balance of power, has been not central to the Indian discourse on foreign policy or security. That certainly, while balance was a clear element in the pre-independence period, the framing of India's foreign policy discourse in terms of more idealist tones, or of Asian solidarity, of non-aligned movement, of East versus the West, or North versus the South, the idea of balance took a secondary position. In fact, I remember in the 70s, when the British were leaving the Indian Ocean, the East of Suez policy, in fact, there was a rejection of the idea that there's a power vacuum, there is a question of balance of power, that it's all about all the developing countries coming together and living happily ever after. So there is that idealist sense that, look, we don't need the concepts like balance of power. These were really European or the Western concepts, and that now we are in a post-balance of power type of politics, say like Panchsheel, or we can solve problems on our own. But I think experience has been a corrective one. Like reality always teaches you to test your assumptions. And I think that's why you see in India's policy since independence a tension between the idealist public formulation and the realist sense of needing to do balance of power. There were moments where you could see clearly, while the discourse remains the same, 75, 80 years later. Say Nehru signing 3 treaties with Nepal, Bhutan, Sikkim in 49-50 was a clear response to China's occupation of Tibet. Then you see 1962, Nehru's attempt to connect with the US to deal with the China challenge. The 1971 treaty with the Soviet Union. And more recently, I would say, what we saw last 20 years of India's engagement with the US, the formation of the Quad. So you can see on the one hand, these elements of balancing behavior. But at the same time, the discourse will continue to be on more idealistic terms, strategic autonomy, independent action. So that tension will endure. But I think one of the key arguments of this book is that the rise of China has created an imbalance for India in its neighborhood. And that rebalancing, that's a part of the title of the book, rebalancing China's power as the gap between India and China has grown so dramatically that today China's economy is 5x of India. Its military spending is 4x of India. And therefore, the dealing with this question becomes, the principal preoccupation. I think that is the key argument here, that you need to balance, and whatever we do, that the balancing question of Chinese power remains a key element, and I think that's part of the book. The second idea that the book is really that as rise of China's effects began to play out in the last few years, we see a clear movement towards conscious balancing in partnership with the US. In fact, you could say last 25 years of Indian history, if you want to take a look, there's a clear correlation between the challenges from China mounting and a balance, and India drawing closer to the US. The revival of the Quad, the expansion of the Quad to this higher level, the deepening of military cooperation between India and the US, all can be seen with the deterioration of India-China relationship. The 4 major military crises that India has had, 2013, 2014, 2017, 2020, you can plot almost the growing tension with China on the one hand, and the need to do more in partnership with the US and the US allies in Asia. And I think that's a dynamic. It is a triangular dynamic that has developed over the last 20 odd years, you could say. The book argues that, look, this is going to be a permanent feature because there is no prospect in the near term of India overcoming through its own means. What we say, I have a lot of young students here, that on bootstraps theory, that you can balance through your own internal mechanics. That is, internal balancing requires a dramatic transformation, while internal balancing remains an important priority, that it needs to be done in coalition with others. That without that coalition, your ability to balance the situation in the region is hard. Therefore, the argument in the book is that this partnership with the US will remain critical. That we need the US, our partnership with the US, to deal with the imbalance that has emerged in Asia with the rise of China and its assertive policies. What has happened in the last few years, of course, is the problems of India with China and the America's problems with China have coincided. Therefore, there's a convergence of interest between India and the US, or US and its allies and India, that we need a more balanced structure and that we proceed towards producing that balance within Asia. That brings me to the third question, which is really the third set of points I wanted to make. What's happened in the last 1 year clearly raises questions about what I'm arguing. So therefore, is the Indo-US relationship, is it sustainable? Is the US really interested in the balance of China, given what Trump has said and done? They talk about a G2. They talk about how the US is dealing with China. Therefore, so is there the credibility or the argument of India and US partnering to produce a balance of power in Asia? Is it sustainable? I mean, I think I would argue, and I think that's why the panel, I'm sure, they'll all have their own views, that I would argue that, look, the contradictions between US and China have not disappeared. But given the fact that China today is a much more powerful state than it was in 2017, when the Quad was first revived, that how to deal with China, that strategy of the United States has changed. So when today US talks about respectful relationship with China, we need to have a respectful dialogue. This is what the national security strategy says. And the other day's Rubio's speech in Munich, those of you heard, it is geopolitical malpractice not to have an engagement with China. Because China is such a power that you cannot not have a dialogue with China. That's a position I think it reflects. As a realist, I mean, I see that. I mean, that is the reality of Chinese power, Chinese military power, what it can do to the historic American presence in the first island chain that is in front of China, today requires dealing with that power in a different way. So does that eliminate the Chinese-American need for a balance? I don't think so. And I think the same thing with us. So when a prime minister goes to a summit, the Shanghai Cooperation Summit, and shakes hands with Putin and Xi Jinping, we're also doing a reset, because for us too, there is no way of escaping the Chinese power. And for us, the problem is even bigger because China is our neighbor. Therefore, how to deal with the Chinese power does not mean it's simply a confrontation. That actually, it is a question of deterrence, it's a question of internal balancing, it's a question of external coalition building. And that set of ideas that have emerged over the last 2 decades, they're not going to disappear. So therefore, the logic of building capability internally and of deterring China, engaging it for specific purposes, that remains. That doesn't take away the balancing imperative as well. So this is where I think those of us who've grown up in the Cold War period, the either-or approaches is very different from the 19th century approach that your friends as well as you got to balance. And I think that difference is what which is very difficult for the Indian discourse to come to terms with. That's partly because we don't think in terms of power, but we see it merely in terms of general positions. But if you look at the relationship between US and Russia and China and the US, is the 3 great powers today. They've been friends, In the Second World War, Russia and America were friends. They've been enemies in the Cold War. They're friends again in the 1990s. Today, they're fighting a war, a proxy war in Europe. The same thing you could say about China and the US. US supported the Chinese national liberation. US then isolated them, then made friends with them again, and today they're fighting them again. So the oscillation of dealing with US relations with China and with Russia tells you that we are in a phase where there is actually, they've been friends, they've been enemies, they've been frenemies. So I think it is this complexity that we have to come to terms with, because China is our neighbor. We have to deal with that reality. That's not going to change. And at the same time, the power imbalance is also not going to change. Therefore, how do we deal with the Chinese power through partnerships with other states? And I think that's where the policy challenges are. And I think I'm sure my arguments need not be the only ones, but I'm sure you're going to hear from the rest of the panel. But the key thing is this, as we said, the title of the panel discussion, that today, US, China, and India, how this triangular dynamic plays out, say, between Trump and Prime Minister Modi, that is the key dynamic. And I think how we can visualize that dynamic, how that plays out in the Asian balance of power, is going to be an interesting one. And I leave it to the panel to discuss this further. Thank you. Thank you all for joining us today.
I'll just throw out a few thoughts as they came to me. I think there's one question that we must address at some point. When we talk about India's foreign policy, is there a difference between a short-term and a long-term approach, given the times we live in, and given that we live in a Trumpian age? Is there a little bit of a holding pattern to things? Is there a little bit of not making very many big decisions, given the volatility of the time? So any significant shifts, any significant reimaginations, can they really happen at a time when you have such a whimsical and unpredictable leader at the helm of, the most powerful country in the world, still, arguably? That's one thought. The second thought is, I think, something that Ambassador Saran flagged. Raja talks a lot about balance, and balance seems a little bit of an odd word for a time when it seems as if two countries are in a hegemonic race. And, is the United States really going to be content with balance? I think is something that we really have to address. And two, if they are, how does it suit us to provide or help or enable that balance? And third, when I hear the word balance, I'm also struck by a counter thought that, to me, the last year and what India has gone through with the United States of America, with China's patronage of Pakistan in Operation Sindoor, actually reminds you that we actually live in a Darwinian age. All this talk about shared values is possibly an esoteric thought. I think Mark Carney gave us that reality check in his comments. And if we do live in this sort of survival of the fittest time, then isn't hard power more important than balance? And how do we achieve that? So these are just three of my thoughts. I am no one to offer sort of expertise beyond that. I'll leave that to the genuine experts. What we're going to do is we're going to give you 7 minutes each for your opening remarks, and then we're going to have a more freewheeling conversation in which I hope many of you from the floor will also ask questions and share your thoughts. So why don't I just start in the order in which we're sitting. Ambassador Singh, I'll start with you. Thank you.
Thanks, Barkha. So I think between Raja's comments, what he has said in the book, and Ambassador Saran's comment, a lot has been said, so I'll try and be brief. First, looking at the title in terms of balancing or rebalancing, I think one challenge will always be that if you're looking at overt rebalancing and you bring in external powers who are stronger than you as part of that rebalancing effort, they will extract their pound of flesh. So what will they demand from you in turn is something that you have to always keep in mind. So my own view would be that instead of that conscious effort, what India, I think, has done and will need to do is that given the main challenge you face, you have to identify the contradictions that are there for that power vis-a-vis the others. And how do those contradictions enable you to use the opportunity to strengthen yourself? And eventually, the challenge that you have to deal with it based on your own strength. at a more critical moment, not based on the support anybody can provide, because that support may or may not be there at that point of time. And I'll come back to this point, that in today's context then, how do we leverage the opportunity to strengthen ourselves? Because China clearly leveraged the phase of globalization of trade and production after the dissolution of Soviet Union and what was seen as the unipolar moment to attract Western capital and investment, use the global situation and strengthen itself and strengthen its manufacturing capacity. Now, what is the opportunity for us? Because that opportunity is now not available. Nobody is talking of globalization of trade and production. But they are talking of secure supply chains, stable supply chains. And now they are talking of new technology partnerships. Because despite whatever US is saying right now, the essence of a competition with China remains. Now, before I come back to that point, the fact also remains, as Ambassador Saran pointed out, that US policy on China has changed. US has not quite figured out how it wants to deal with China. Clinton spoke of China as a strategic partner. The vice president under Reagan, he went to China and said that the rise of China was in US interest. It was George Bush in 1999 during his campaign, speaking at the Reagan National Center, when he spoke of China being a strategic competitor, and in that very paragraph spoke about building a new relationship with India. So they saw building a new partnership with India, perhaps as working to serve in the US interests. Because what I heard very often from some sections in the US, that even if India was not overtly anti-China, a strong India in its own right would be a natural constraint on some of China's unilateral assertions and positions, and that worked for US interests. To the extent that that was valid, of course, it works for us. But once, the reason, as Ambassador Saran also pointed out, why they looked at the Civil Nuclear Cooperation Agreement was to enable the building of the US-India partnership, because without the Civil Nuclear Cooperation Agreement, US could not do high technology partnerships with India because of all the restrictions they had. And so where we are now would not have been possible, even defense cooperation would not have been possible without having done the Civil Nuclear Cooperation Agreement. And with that partnership, with India's economic, technological position strengthening, in itself, they felt, would also work for US interest. But after George Bush, in the Obama administration, first couple of years, we heard that the US wanted to do strategic reassurance to China, that they would accommodate China's rise within a broadly harmonious framework. Now, when that didn't work, they started talking of pivot to Asia, or a rebalance to Asia. And even that they were not able to carry out because the challenges in Europe continued, challenges in West Asia continued. Now, it was during the first Trump term that US clearly identified in the national security strategy, national defense strategy, as China as the main competitor, the country with the intent and capability to replace the US in the international system. Series of cabinet officials came out with statements saying that China was a challenge, the Chinese Communist Party was a challenge, US needed to deal with that. And then you had the Indo-Pacific strategy, the Quad being reactivated, and meeting up to the foreign minister level. The Biden administration took that forward and took Quads to the summit level. But then they said, we are not looking at decoupling, but we are looking at de-risking from China. So again, tone down a bit the competition related to China. Now, once we come now to Trump 2.0, the language has clearly changed. As was pointed out, in the national defense strategy, they're now saying respectful conversation with China, have communication. And also, we are not hearing anymore the talk of sailing through the Taiwan Straits or freedom of navigation operations that they said they would carry out to challenge what China was asserting in South China Sea. We are not hearing that very overtly for some time. And what they are talking about is now, along the first island chain, building anti-access and area denial capability to prevent China from challenging the US at that level. Now, one can legitimately make the argument that this would suggest that US has already withdrawn a bit in the Pacific from its earlier position. Because earlier we were hearing about anti-access area denial as a Chinese strategy. Now it is seen as a US strategy along the first island chain. Now, given that, how will US deal with China? Trump has already said that he's going to visit China in April. She is coming to visit US later. We don't yet see any dates related to a visit by Trump for the Quad Summit or taking forward those discussions. So US will work out its own approach to China based on its assessment of its own interest. But I still believe, and now we are meeting at the time when the AI Impact Summit is on, if you hear the conversations there from American companies, American tech companies, it is clear that they see China as their main challenge. That in the entire discourse on AI, the players are US, China. You don't hear of Europe being anywhere. You don't hear of Japan being anywhere. You don't hear of any other country being really competing with them in terms of the core technologies. So they see China as their main challenge. The whole effort is devoted to preventing China or slowing down China's rise in these areas and accelerating the US rise. And in fact, one of the senior officials commented that from what they have information, in the next few years, US companies are going to invest $600 billion in the United States in building out the infrastructure for AI. And they've said this level of investment in such a short period of time has not happened in the history of capitalism. So there is a major effort to build out US strength in this competition. Now, as they build out the US strength in this competition, they will find India as an important partner. Because even in AI, the core technologies are with US companies, but a huge amount of work on applications based on these technologies is happening in India. I saw one comment that Google, for example, has invested in 80 companies doing applications related to AI. 60 of those companies are Indian companies. And 20% of global talent in semiconductor design is based in India. So the US, wanting for its own purposes to maintain its lead in innovation, in technology and in AI, sees India as a necessary partner. And I think that will give us the opportunity to leverage different relationships to strengthen ourselves in the new phase of technology and economic development. And I think that's the partnership that we will need to leverage. Now, while doing that, and as a final note of caution, we also have to watch closely where US politics is headed. Now, if you saw, the US National Defense Strategy says that US will no longer follow cloud castle notions of a rules-based international order. Now, for the US to say that, because so far they were saying that we should have a rules-based international order. Secretary Rubio, in his speech in Munich, has once again said that US doesn't believe in the concept of a rules-based international order. That means assertion of might is right. Now, what are the consequences of that? And again, Secretary Rubio, in his speech in Munich, in an attempt to appeal to the Europeans there, slightly different from Vance, says that the United States is the child of Europe and that Europe has lost its vibrancy. And Europe was vibrant at a time when it was building empire. And the United States has said that Trump has said that UK is making a mistake by giving Chagos archipelago back to Mauritius. Now, what is the message coming out of the US with this particular set of politics? Obviously, that is something we have to watch carefully and with some anxiety. So while we do that, I mean, this is not all of the United States. There are different people in the US who think differently. We'll have to leverage the domestic politics in the US, see which way it develops. Use the opportunity that presents itself, but also be very, very cautious. So, thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Singh. General Shukla, you and I were, I think Professor Happyman will speak last. I'll come to you. You want to speak from the podium? Go ahead. But just a sentence I was going to say that you and I were talking yesterday about the American envoy's visit to the Western Military Command. That has also generated a reasonable amount of debate, not because it's the first ever, but because of the backdrop in which it comes. And I put a question to you that I'll repeat, that would we ever imagine the China envoy being at the Western Military Command? So I just want to put a thought out there as you step up to make your opening remarks. Please.
The Indian envoy at the Indo-Pacific Command. So, that's a false argument. I just showed a photograph that was sent to me of the Indian envoy to the US at the Indo-Pacific Command in Hawaii. So I was there along with Defense Minister Mr. Parikar. So it is normal.
Okay. More on that in the Q&A, but General Shukla. That's quite a photograph.
All right, so friends, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Before I come to the book, one short line in praise of Professor Raja Mohan. I've been reading him for years, his articles and his books and his many offerings and all that. I'll say that Professor Raja Mohan, each time he writes something, he tells us he's ahead of India's strategic thinking by a decade, if not two. So that's the one short point in praise of Professor Raja Mohan. Now here are some thoughts in the context of the given subject, Trump, Xi, Modi and the Asian balance, and in response to the questions posed. I just wish to make 5 bullet points, but before that, Mr. Shyam Saran raised a very interesting point about the balance of powers. So, some thoughts just went through my head, and I just thought I'll raise them with with the audience. You see, even in Prime Minister Nehru's construct, whatever he had of the balance of power, the quarrel I have with that construct was that the instrument of force, or the positioning of the instrument of force, was ambiguous, if not skewed. And that had some consequences. So, for example, Mr. Shyam Saran referred to the fact of, British generalship continuing post-independence. So there is an explicit conversation between a gentleman called General Nathu Singh and Prime Minister Nehru. And Nathu was really one of our bright generals, 1930s, 40s. He's talking of a two-front threat. Pak China, he's talking of the need to raise the defense budget with Sardar Baldev Singh, with Sarojini Naidu. And he was somebody who was tipped to be the chief. But in this conversation with Nehru, Prime Minister Nehru tells him, Nathu is arguing that we should have Indian generals straight away. He says there is Manekshaw, there is Thimaia. And the Navy and the Air Force agree to British admirals and air marshals continuing. And Nathu is arguing, sir, we have it and we can make this transition now. But Prime Minister Nehru gets annoyed and Nathu cheekily asks Mr. Nehru, he says, sir, if we are not, the army doesn't have the experience to transit, what experience do you have? And he paid the price for that. But the point is really not that. The point is, if you read Fareed Zakaria, Post-American World, he tells you that in the early 1950s, Prime Minister Nehru wanders into the MOD and he flies into a rage when he sees uniformed officers. And Fareed, who's brought up in the American system, says that if uniformed officers are not seen in the MOD, where will they be seen? And see, what happened in consequence was, and there are many other stories. I've heard General Sundarji, when I was a mere major, telling us that Nehru tried to reach out to the Indian military brass, but in response, his view was that they were not very, shall I say, intellectually up to it, and the term that he used was shallow whiskey drinking generals. Whatever the reason. And in that breach, the civil service stepped in. And that had grave consequences to our HDO. So that's the real point I wanted to make. And that took a long while to get corrected, till I think the 1980s when Mr. Rajiv Gandhi strikes a good rapport with General Sundarji, defense budget succeed 3%, mechanization, Kargil Review Committee, and a lot of those infirmities are corrected. So I would just urge that since hard power again is returning as the currency in today's age, we must be very careful about the positioning of the instrument of force. Even today, despite all our challenges, it doesn't get passionate embrace. It just gets a little love and affection. 2% of GDP is certainly not passionate embrace. It's just bare love and affection. So I would argue for better resourcing of the instrument of force. Now, there are 5 short points I wish to make in the context of the subject. One is that, it seems to me as the Cold War between the USA and the Dragon Bear hots up. It's quite clearly moving from the mid-slopes to the peak. It seems to me, and here I would differ slightly with Ambassador Arun Singh, if you read the national security strategy, the national defense strategy, Colby's remarks both in Europe and in Seoul, my reading is that the Western Hemisphere, Venezuela, all that stuff is merely shoring up of the firm base. In the Middle East, it will be a suppressive strike here and there. In Europe, you see reordering of primary, secondary responsibilities for the deterrence of Asia. But this final argument will be settled in Asia. Oh, sorry, it was Europe, Asia. In fact, my reading of these strategies tells me very clearly that the Americans are saying that their ultimate or their primary object is to checkmate Chinese hegemony in Asia. And the rest I have described, how I see it. Now, this argument could be settled in many ways. It could be a truce. It would be some kind of modus vivendi, a G2 of sorts. It may be some form of stabilization and deterrence, but even a bare-knuckled bloody fight, even that could occur. And so, therefore, of the two timelines for conflict which are being bandied about, 2027 as Taiwan, whereabouts? I was in Berlin 3 months back. Officialdom in Germany is talking of Putin attacking NATO by 2028. And there's a massive rearmament drive. So, of the two timelines, I think Taiwan will be more consequential. The second point is about Taiwan, because I think it's extremely important even in India's strategic calculus. Xi's search for legacy will come up against Trump's deterrence by denial. And the NDS is very categoric, deterrence by denial. The way, look at the arms package to Taiwan. Look at Takaichi in Japan, the resourcing of South Korea. So I think the Chinese are in for trouble. The deterrence equation, at least the military deterrence equation, which was tilting towards the Chinese, is now returning to some kind of balancing. And that is one of the reasons why you see this crisis in generalship, because he is pushing his generals. And this is not recent. I forget the gentleman's name. There was an Air Force general 3 years back, a pretty respected guy in the PLA. He propositioned Xi against doing Taiwan. And he said, 330, for your 3 days of glory, China will be in misery for 30 years. So much of the top brass has been talking against this, giving Xi the professional advice that we are not ready, and that is annoying Xi. So I'm saying this, this legacy of this Xi's search for legacy and this whole business of the Americans doing deterrence by denial is going to be a very serious question in the first island chain. May I also suggest to you that quite apart from the questions of history and legacy, there are critical geostrategic implications as well. If China does Taiwan successfully and breaks out of the first island chain, not long thereafter, Chinese naval power will be knocking at the doors of Los Angeles. That is what worries the Americans, as also in the IOR. That should worry us greatly. So Taiwan is consequential for India too. I mean, there's a lot of people say that Trump will not stand up for Taiwan. Let me tell you one or two reasons why he may. If Xi does Taiwan successfully, it will be like the Suez moment for the United States of America. There will be a precipitous decline in power. I don't think Trump will allow that. So, these are some of the thoughts that come to my head. And all right. And if USA and China do get into, let me also make this point. I think Ambassador Arun Singh already made it. India, we are still the fourth largest economy, maybe third in the near future. We are also the third ranked in comprehensive terms national power, Lowy's Institute. If you study that chart carefully, while they are called the superpowers, we are a major power. AI, certainly we are not in frontline AI, but we are a dark horse. If you see the technology tracker of ASPI, while China and USA lead by a huge margin, we are quite up there. So I'm saying, are we not the third most consequential power? So we are in the big league now. And therefore, from now to 2047, we need to start thinking, operating as a player in the big league. That is something I sometimes worry is not being done, in adequate measure. Look at the AI race. And therefore, we really need to step up. Ambassador Arun Singh was giving some figures. What came to my mind is the AI investments in the United States today are $1 billion every day. And there is a reason for it, because it's such virgin territory that there is no use case that fails. Look at the investments in India. And from the private sector, they're not forthcoming. The advantage that China has is in electricity. They are adding 1 gigawatts of electricity every day. And that's going to, affect AI. It is in these big kind of things we are not there. We really need to step up our game. In fact, on AI, since I'm I'm study that subject very closely. There are three distinct pathways. The Americans are going hell for leather on superintelligence, and they're pretty confident they'll get to it in 2 to 3 years, whether they'll get to it or not. China at one time was trying to keep pace with them on this. Now they have given up. And they are saying they will do in the AI world what they did in manufacturing. So scaling up, the Chinese models proliferating right through, so market domination. Now India has taken impact, which is the third way, innovation, smaller models of lesser ambition, but the gap is huge. And the race is still between USA and China in different domains. So that's how the AI thing is playing out. The third point I'd like to make is this, that despite the recent Trumpian shocks, there seems to be a fit, at least I think it that way in the long term, between the convergent geopolitical interests and the democratic values of India and USA, certainly greater than any prospect of a Sino-Indian peace or cooling off. That does seem to be the reality. So we do need to tweak our strategic autonomy to facilitate a technological lean with the USA. And on these areas of AI, quantum, space, I don't see anybody else giving us that, none of the middle powers. So that is something that we have to really consider. The fourth point I'd like to make is this, that it does seem to me that China seeks a unipolar Asia. I mean, all my reading, all my understanding of stuff tells me that the test of Indian statecraft will be to make it settle for a multipolar one. That's pretty obvious. Preferably by engagement, persuasion, diplomacy, better still through calibrated deterrence, to achieve which we need American technologies, nothing else. Today, the Indian military along the LAC is pretty strong. It doesn't need blood, doesn't need treasure, just technology. So if we have to tweak our strategic autonomy in practical ways, that is something we could think of. A technologically enabled Indian military is also in the American national interest. I mean, that's something the Americans should see. So this point that Professor Raja Mohan makes in his book about how you utilize the space between alliances and non-alignment, I would suggest that there is space for a non-allied partnership, but this partnership cannot be built on sentiments. So we have to resource this. In what form? No commitments, but a framework of aligned interests, shared risks, real proportionate contributions, and there are many things that can be worked out here. In fact, it's my sense that if the Biden administration had stuck on, much of that would have fructified. Trump and Indo-Pacific. Now, if Indo-US the relationship is back on keel, there is a lot of stuff that can be done here in practical ways, which will be of mutual benefit to both. May I also suggest that there should be no commitments, but there can be many hints of prospective collaborations. We don't have to be public about it, but the message can go to China. So, and the last point I want to make is this, that, I think we are in that phase where we have considerable weight and influence, but we, as of yet, have to convert it into power. That is our big challenge, and this conversion cannot happen in lazy ways, because I've told you what the grim competition is, right from the military space to the technological space. We are doing a lot, but we need to do far more. So let me just tell you, look at the technologies of the fourth industrial revolution. It's just not AI, space, EW. We really need to leverage them. We have the talent, but for various reasons, that's not happening. Look at AI dominance. In Ukraine today, AI is doing the planning, the vision, and the killing better than humans. You already have a combat case. You just have to replicate it in India as a business opportunity. These are some of the opportunities that we are missing. And one final point in terms of strategic outlook, since we are talking of 2047, that's not a very long time in strategic military affairs, we do need to change our focus from mere territorial defense to homeland security, which means securing our cities, so on and so forth, for which we can today convert the LC and the LAC into these lethal dronery frontiers, which is a reality in Ukraine. Today, anything in Ukraine is brought down within 7 minutes. Those are the killing chains. AI-enabled command and control systems. This is something we can do. And if we can somehow plug this with automated air defense systems, which is far beyond Akash Tir, but will go into space-enabled systems, infrared radars, long-range discrimination radars, along with the drone missile force, we'll have the Sudarshan Chakra that the Prime Minister talks of. And it is this Sudarshan Chakra that we need to secure India's rise. And if we do that, we will not only rebalance Asia, but perhaps also secure a decent peace for the world. Thank you.
Happy one.
Thank you, Barka. Ambassador Saran has said the cat among the pigeons, or should I say, the doves and the hawks. So I'm going to I spent about 2 full days reading Raja's book, so I'm going to give a few remarks on the book before I come to the balance of our question probably at the end. I think, as a student and teacher of India's foreign policy for the last 2 decades, I must say that Professor Mohan has done a great service to the students of international relations, India's foreign policy, by going back into history, digging up the historical foundations of India's foreign policy. There is, routinely you read a lot of work on India's foreign policy, and all of that is ahistorical, as if, India started in 1947. There was no history, there was no prehistory to India's existence. As if, the Indian policymakers and politicians and thinkers started thinking only in 1947. I think to that extent, this is a great service to international relations. We do have a selective memory in some ways about our strategic past. I'll come to that in a bit, but there is a school that thinks that things only started in 1947. There is a school that thinks that no, there is an important history, both as Raja Mohan pointed out and as Ambassador Saran pointed out, that you can actually go back hundreds of years and dig up that history and see how the Indian mind, why the Indian mind behaves in a particular way. Today, even today for that matter, there is a certain continuity, I think, that needs to be taken on board. We often often recall that we are the legacy state of the British Empire in South Asia, but we also have a tendency to forget that we have a glorious maritime history, that we are a seafaring nation, that for thousands of years we have had a very rich maritime history and an expansive view of what our neighborhood constituted. So I think this book has in many ways managed to bring that back for our attention. The second point that I want to make is about, in fact, I will go a little one step further, since this is the day of provocations. Let me also say that since 1947, India has, speaking as an academic, purely as an academic, I also believe that India has developed a certain landlocked mindset in its approach to grand strategy. I think this is partly a result of forgetting our past, forgetting our history, or what happened before 1947, be it the colonial government or the empires before that. And somehow also forgetting the balance of power that happened in history 200 years before India became independence. And I think part of that landlocked mindset that we are now trying to shed, or has been trying to shed because of the arrival of Indo-Pacific in some ways, is because as soon as India became independent in 1947, we were dealt with the Kashmir issue, the India-Pakistan war, and then 1962 happened. So it sort of, the continent kept us busy. We simply did not have any time to focus on the maritime. And I think I would also say that the temptations and the joys of the primacy that we enjoyed in South Asia, in the continental South Asia, also kept us hooked to South Asia in some ways, and probably we didn't give enough attention to the maritime space. We were in some ways boxed into the South Asian continental space. And I think that is, one of the things that Raja Mohan brings out in his book is that is changing today. Both his first work in 2012 on Samudra Manthan and the current work put a lot of focus on reviving that maritime history. If you actually look at, if you carefully look at India's strategic identity, it is possible to argue that India has a dual strategic identity, right? There is on the one hand the continental identity, that we are a continental nation. There is on the other hand the maritime identity, that we are a maritime nation. There has been a lopsidedness in our understanding or reconciling these two identities, but I think understanding these two identities is very important. What you have in your continental space as opportunities, as challenges, and as partners are not the same in the sort of maritime space. Just to give you an example, you have the United States of America in the Quad, you have the Europeans, you have the Koreans and the Japanese and the Australians. None of those guys are actually in the continent when you have to sort of deal with the continental challenges. In fact, the America, which is your partner in the Indo-Pacific, will actually create problems for you in the continent, be it in dealing with Pakistan or in Afghanistan or, say, Bangladesh or other countries for that matter. Whereas, on the other hand, the partners that you have in your continental space, namely the Russian Federation, is not very happy with your forays into the Indo-Pacific. It thinks that it is there to, India is doing that to checkmate China, which is its own partner in some ways. So I think managing this somewhat of a contradictory strategic identity that we have, which is the maritime and the the continental, is going to be one of our biggest challenges going forward. Raja does a great job in sort of bringing out the finer elements of the trilemma that we face, the US, China, India trilemma. I want to sort of complicate that by sort of throwing in a few more trilemmas, as it were. I think there is the US, India, China trilemma, clearly. There is also the China, India, Russia trilemma. The sort of more you move away from Russia, the closer Russia is going to get to China, which is going to be a problem for us. And of course, there is the US, India, Russia trilemma. I think a lot of our diplomacy going forward is going to be about managing the contradictions in each of these trilemmas, in sort of separating each of these trilemmas and seeing what angle you can use in a particular trilemma without it affecting the balance in the other. It sort of sounds very complicated gymnastics. But I think this careful balancing is going to be at the root of, whether we call it strategic autonomy or the new avatar of non-alignment, whatever. But I think this balancing will need to take place because, as Jan Shukla pointed out, we are one of the biggest powers in the international system. It's not easy for us to sort of make those decisions to align with another power, not only because of temperament, but also I think because of the strategic realities that are sort of dealt to us, as it were. I want to sort of very quickly come to the balancing question. My sense, again, as an academic, is that we have a complicated balancing history, as it were. Pratap Bhanu Mehta has this very interesting coinage. He says India believes in contingent balancing. When there is a contingency, we balance, and then we don't sort of stick to that, then we move on with other things. So there's a contingent balancing. And to Raja's point, which is, have we been sufficiently cognizant of the need to balance? Did we balance China enough historically? In the 1950s, Raja makes a very interesting argument that we probably did not balance China enough in the 1950s. He brings up some very interesting evidence, I think from the US Congressional Library, I don't know where it is, and he uses that to argue that India actually refused the UNSC seat, which was offered to India, and probably made the argument that, give it to China or something along those lines. If that is actually, if the documentation is accurate, I think that is perhaps not a great example of balancing. 1962 happens. We did balance China. Did we sustain with that balancing for the longer period? I'm doubtful. 1964 happens. You have the Chinese nuclear test, Lopnor. India continued to sort of persist with the nuclear disarmament till about early mid 1990s. Chinese kept arming Pakistan. Did we sort of balance that out sufficiently adequately? We also have, of course, the changing of maps or the Doklam on 2020. Even today, for that matter, again, it's just to add a little provocation to the mix, Baraka, are we balancing China sufficiently today? Is there a decision at the strategic level to balance China sufficiently? The point that I'm trying to make is that, and to be fair to Raja, there is an inconsistent balancing behavior that we see through these various episodes. And therefore, the argument that he makes that balancing is not the default common sense wisdom in the Indian strategic culture. I think that's what I wanted to say. You know, Barka, you sort of asked one general question in the beginning. If you were to sort of think of a significant reimagination of India's foreign policy, what would that be? And I would say India's decision to take to the Indo-Pacific decisively, and I am cognizant of General Shukla sitting here, of sort of, you know, the landlocked, focused, you know, look on the continent and move that away from the continent to the Indo-Pacific. I think that, in my mind, is the one decisive strategic reimagination that we've undertaken in the recent past. Back to you.
Thank you. Okay, let's open this up for questions and comments, and I'll happy one pick up from where you left off on the trilemmas. One of the arguments that Raja makes in the book about China is that India and China are simultaneously partners, competitors, and potentially adversaries, right? And I think we've all agreed that in the next few years, the challenge is going to be to manage these sort of contradictions. The other sort of manifestation of this dilemma, trilemma, whatever you want to call it, we've already seen with our position on, not officially acknowledged, but the Americans claim that we have said that we are not going to buy Russian oil. As of now, we're still purchasing Russian oil, but it's a declined quantity. What's happened immediately and what is going to happen? You're going to see Russia and China coming closer on this. Russia will divert that oil probably at better rates to China. So we're living through exactly what you've just described in academic terms. So let's start with the China question. I'll start maybe in reverse. I'll start with you. How do you see this balancing of China when you say, has India balanced China enough with all of these other sort of contradictions you speak about? We're going to be hosting BRICS, you know. How do we balance this?
Well, again, I mean, let me put it this way. There is no doubt in my mind, I think also probably in the author's mind, that China is India's principal contradiction. There's no doubt about that. Here is a $20 trillion economy, and here is a $4 trillion economy. Going by the history of international politics, structurally speaking, these two powers, who are not going to be bandwagoning with each other, cannot coexist peacefully next door to each other. That's the reality of international life, no question. But the question, therefore, is can we do completely away with any China connection, for that matter? No, China is one of India's biggest trading partners. India and China collaborate on the climate question, on issues of global South questions. All of that needs to happen. But I think there is no doubt that if this is your principal contradiction, you go to muster the courage, you go to muster the resources in order to checkmate the potential aggression from that particular adversary. How do you do that? Do you have the power to do that? You don't have the power to do that. So you may have to look for options in terms of coalitions of convenience, in terms of other principal contradictions. And I think what Raja is trying to, in my opinion, argue in the book is that for the United States, China is going to be a principal contradiction in the longer run. So if there is a convergence of that interest and your interest, hey, you need to find ways of balancing
But what if that changes? I think that's the point, General Shukla. Let me take that to you. What if that changes? What if the Americans under Trump look to cut a deal with China? What does that do to the Quad? What does that do to what Happy Mon has just articulated? What does that do to our own China policy? And I may remind, not that you need reminding, but there is the Vice Chief of the Indian Army on record saying that the conflict with Pakistan in Operation Sindoor was like fighting two adversaries. You were fighting the Pakistanis militarily, but China had its hand on Pakistan's head the whole time.
So, if we have to deal with China, which is a very serious competitor, it can't be by reacting to what Trump says, or, it needs a very long-term, calm, thoughtful kind of analysis. And therefore, you see, when people talk of the Indian NSS and Indian NDS, it's not those 20 pages coming out. But in the process of writing the strategy, you examine all these issues. What should we do here? What should we do there? And therefore, the true value lies in that. And if we somehow cannot write NSS, NDS ourselves, let's ask Claude to do it now. And then we can grapple with it. But on a more serious note, see, I'll say why all these issues are connected. For example, now, if we are a power to reckon with and we decide to up our defense budget, we can have combat overmatch with Pakistan. Look at Pakistan is 1/10 of our economic size. I mean, some people say its economy is less than the Bombay Stock Exchange, and it keeps poking us militarily. So, and I'll tell you why it's important. Unless you do that, you cannot make a turn to the seas. Because each time some China, we start looking at China along the LAC, he does something here. So with Pakistan, it has to be combat overmatch, and there are many military ways of doing it so that you can make a turn to the seas. Now, if you don't make a turn to the seas now, this 500-ship Chinese Navy in 15 years, 10 years is going to be in the IOR. So either we make an A2AD of the Chinese kind, or we project power beyond Malacca. Now, these issues, the time is now. We can't go on with 20 ships a year when the Chinese are doing fine. The lag keeps growing. The military component, and this is my, back of the envelope analysis, the military component of the power differential with China is $450 billion year on year. And that lag, we just keep drifting. Now, if you don't have the money and you don't do the other stuff fast enough, theater commands, look at how procurement reform is taking place across the globe. Procurement reform. I mean, the Americans have said clearly that procurement will not work for the kind of innovation that we want. And they've done a series of things. All those issues, if they do not happen concurrently, the lag with China, if not in straight numbers, in the larger sense will keep going. And let me just make 2 more points, Barka. Is it also, I spoke of the need to change from territorial defense to homeland security, which is a challenge. Is it also not time for India to start looking at hemispheric influence? I recall I was a lieutenant colonel when Mr. Subramaniam in the IDSA explained this business of DIA theater commands. He said the Indian military must start looking beyond the LCLAC. So the DIA must shape the immediate region. The theater commanders must have a quasi-diplomatic role. So in writing and thinking through the NSS, NDS, it is this comprehensive churn that needs to take place. If that doesn't take place, we'll keep reacting. Now, we are a big enough nation, I mean, we survive, but we will not be the power that we wish to be, a sophisticated. And the last point, Marka, all these corrections that we talk of for the last 10 years, they don't get reflected in the budget. The budget is the same: tanks, artillery, guns. It has to be AI, it has to be, are other militaries doing it? Yes. So it is a larger churn, strategic military churn. We need, much of it can be done within the allotted budget and some with additionalities. But this somehow doesn't happen. A lot of people like General Hasnain have been advocating for some time now that we should have a larger civil military wargaming. A lot of people together discuss all this, and that I don't see happening, and that's the reason.
Okay. Let me bring you to my question. If we do see Trump with his G2 vision of the world make a dramatic shift in America's China policy, if India becomes less valuable to America's need to contain this rising China, what does that do to sort of, what is the counter move on the chessboard?
So I draw your attention to Patrick McGee's book. It's The Capture of Apple by China.
I've read it, yeah.
And it shows how China leveraged US companies to build up its tech ecosystem. And 28 million people were skilled in China through the tech ecosystem that Apple developed there. And Apple developed a large number of component and other manufacturers. So we should let Trump do whatever he's doing. Whether he wants to have a sharp tone towards China or a different tone. I think we should focus on building the tech and other partnerships, which US companies are very keen to build. And use those partners. You've seen the announcements here. Microsoft, Google, Amazon have announced about $70 billion of investments in India. So we should look at building those partnerships to strengthen our own capabilities. And I think that's the way to deal with the challenge we have at the moment. and not necessarily just respond to whatever Trump may be doing for his own reasons.
Very quickly from all three of you, quickly only because we're a little behind time and I want to take questions. There's a kind of furious debate around policy vis-a-vis the United States of America, with trust not broken but certainly chipped away at. Is this a relationship that you believe has altered forever, or is this a passing phase? I'll start with you.
Yeah, so I'll say this. I think for 25 years, the attempt was step by step to build more confidence in the relationship. In India, there is a deep suspicion because of the past related to the United States. Anything you do with the US, people look at it with suspicion. Anything you do with Russia, even if it is challenging, people look at it favorably. Again, because of the history. That's where we were gradually coming out of that. But because of what Trump has done, it has revived in the Indian psyche the feeling that US is an unreliable and coercive partner. So we have to deal with that. But ultimately, I think we have to factor in and build our policy keeping that in mind. No country does a foreign policy decision to help another country. No country. Every country looks at its own interest. And so we should be prepared for the fact that the US will be taking decisions from time to time based on its assessment of its interest. And it will change. Now, US is a democracy. Every presidential candidate defines his policy as different from that of his predecessor. As a result, you should expect that from one president to the other, policy is going to change. Because they are such a big power, as the policy changes, it impacts on us. So you have to be supple enough to adapt to that change. It is bound to happen. And so I think that's the only way to negotiate with it. So only two lines I'll say. Build with the US, but hedge and diversify more. Do more defense cooperation with the US, but never be security dependent on the US. And then you're okay.
Okay. General Shukla, to those who say that what happened in the last year was a result of India leaning in too much towards the United States of America, what would you say?
I'm saying that all the other good friends, they must remain good friends. Russia and the other good friends must remain good friends. But in the current phase of strategic evolution, USA does have a unique position in India's strategic calculus and vice versa. So I'm just talking of a technological lean. And to get those technologies, if we have to make some concessions, go ahead and make them, because it is the grand bargain that matters. And the Americans equally must understand that a technologically enabled Indian strategic military system is the American self-interest. So I'm saying lean because we can afford the lean. We are a stronger player today. We are not vulnerable in any way. I mean, if the Americans backtrack for some reason, we also have cards. So lean to a certain extent.
We have enough leverage to.
Why not?
What is our leverage?
I mean, look at the trade deal. Whatever. If I'm not
if you had to define.
Yeah, I'm telling you. So
leverage,
if I'm no expert, but if the trade deal has been concluded on favorable terms, did we not stand up to the Americans? We did. Did we recommend Trump for a Nobel Prize? We did. So we have many cards, and I'm not saying that get into. I mean, see, Ambassador Arun Singh and all are wiser than me. They know how to handle Trump. So handle Trump. Do all that you can to please him. But these technologies, I don't see them coming from anywhere else.
Okay, I think the world has seen that nobody knows actually how to handle Trump. The Europeans tried obsequiousness, that didn't work. They tried toughness, that didn't necessarily work. I want to open it up. I think, Happy Moon, is it okay with you? Let's take questions. Oh my God, there's a lot of hands. Admiral, I'll start. Several questions, yes. Is there a mic on the floor? Can we start here? Oh, okay, let's start with ma'am. Yes.
Thank you. I'm Professor Jyoti M. Pathania from OP Jindal Global University. I just, I think our foreign minister also made a statement with respect to dysfunctional multilateralism. So is there a way out for plurilateralism? If it is, what would be India's plurilateralism strategy in its India's foreign policy? And how successful will it be?
Okay, who wants to take that? You want me to take two or three? Okay, let's take them together. You all remember them or I'll remember them. Here in the front, sir. Can you come here in the front?
I'm KJ Alphonse from Tourism Ministry of India.
Yes.
I'm not an expert in defense or in foreign relations, though I was in the Parliament Committee on defense for 4 years. I was also in the Parliament Committee on MEA for 4 years. statement, I want a response. Not a shot will be fired when China takes over Taiwan, and that will be soon. I want a response from my batchmate. Number two.
Yes.
Number two. Xi and Jing and Putin have made it extremely clear, in absolute categorical terms, that whatever happens, that's capital letters, whatever happens, our friendship will be sustained. We will do everything possible, again capital letters, to maintain that friendship. How do we depend on Russia for our independence? There's two questions. One is a comment, the other is a question. I don't to you because
Okay.
you're my batchmate.
Okay, I'm going to take two, because it'll be very difficult to keep the thread otherwise, Happy Mon. So, Sir, Ambassador Singh, why don't you just quickly respond, and also to the first question, if anyone wants to pick that up. Yeah.
Alphonse, I am paying the price of being your batchmate. So on Taiwan, I think even she wouldn't be sure what will happen.
Yeah.
So hence all this. So I'm not sure that he's sure. I think Americans are not sure also what will happen. So I think we are all living in that uncertainty. On Russia, I think so far, whatever we've seen, is that Russia has sought to reassure India that at least on India-China issues, it is not with China. So that's the evidence so far. We'll have to see how it plays out in the future. I think Russia also needs to show to China and globally that they have options beyond just China. That's what works for them. They don't want to be dependent only on China. And on the plurilateralism question, I'll just say that, you try different combinations. Trump has made it clear that he does not believe in anything except unilateralism.
Yeah.
So that's the world you're dealing with.
Correct. Okay.
So you're seeing what India is doing. India is doing Quad, India is doing BRICS, India
SCO.
is doing SCO.
Yeah, correct.
Do it all.
Okay, ma'am, I have to give other people a chance, please. Yes. Sir, next to you. Yes. Yeah.
Hello, sir. My name is Shansh Mohan. I'm with the Institute of Chinese Studies. Lieutenant General Shukla mentioned about the aspect when it comes to having a hegemonic presence, or at least with respect to with your territory and all that stuff. So if we see the outlook of South Asia at this point of time, India clearly does not have friends. And one of the friends that we particularly talk about is Taliban, that Professor Jacob clearly talks about that we should engage. Now, when he talks about hemispheric presence in South Asia, I think that really needs a relook, especially with the neighborhood first policy, because that is not on a functional note, at least not now. So,
Okay. All right, I'll take one more question. There, yes. I'll come that side after that, yeah.
Thank you, moderator. My addressee would be Master Arun Singh. This is journalist Anang Matra. My most recent venture is the newsite.in. So you cited two things. I would have my offshoot question from there. One, 600 billion investment. What are this money going to be within what timeline, if you could kindly explain? The second thing, you mentioned Facebook, Meta, and a couple of companies in the US. So there's a Paul Comteori equals FANG, which is the erstwhile name of the Facebook, the Meta's.
What's your question, sir?
Despite there are a lot of companies and there are a lot of minds from IITs and IIMs who are running those FANG, the Facebook.
Yes.
Why India can't build the capital or can't build the global size mindset, having its Silicon Valley presence?
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Happy Mon, I'll give you the first one. Hemispheric domination in a neighborhood where you have, I have to say, a tenuous new start with Bangladesh, maybe, absolute hostility with Pakistan, and you know the rest. I don't have to go through each country. You want to respond?
Barka, very quickly, I will say that
Yes.
there's no doubt that India is the hegemon in South Asia. That's a structural fact. There's no taking away from that. But I think the age of crude hegemony is over. There will have to be sophisticated, smarter ways of modernizing India's hegemony in South Asia. And I don't know what the general meant by the sort of hemispheric safeguarding of the region. But I will say this, South Asia, I've written quite a lot about it. In my own sense, India should focus more on the global stage, more in the Indo-Pacific. We can't get caught into the silly games in South Asia, the more you get, there's only so much diplomatic, military, and political capital that you have. So I don't think our objective should be to bend over backwards to win back South Asia.
General Shukla, you wanted to quickly respond to that? Sorry, I'm interrupting you all a little in the interest of taking more questions. Yeah.
So what I meant by hemispheric influence is this. I mean, you play all your cards, diplomacy, all that stuff you do. But is a military element important? If we are a big power now, look how, what America's response is in terms of stabilizing its periphery, what China's response is. So I'm saying the Indian military could play the game in the gray zone. Today there is a lot of chaos in Myanmar. There is a special envoy who deals with the EAOs and all that. That was the exact purpose of the DIA. The DIA was meant to play the intelligence game in the periphery and not along the LAC. And also it will get linked with theater commanders and that whole stuff. Like the point I was making yesterday, our military diplomacy is underwhelming. Look, the doors of Washington were open to Asim Munir by Kuruvilla. We should welcome Paparo meeting our theater commanders.
Okay.
We should do all that. So in that sense, I'm saying grow your influence.
So very quickly, $600 billion investment is what US officials have indicated in the next couple of years in the infrastructure of AI, which includes data centers, compute capacity, semiconductors, various areas. And General Shukla himself spoke about almost $1 billion of investment per day in the US in this sector. So that's how they are looking at it. And in terms of your other question, there's a whole issue related to the ecosystem, component manufacturing system. So all that has to be there for what you're asking.
Okay, I have time for just two quick last questions from the floor, and maybe Raja, you can throw in a question of your own. So I'll come this side of the room. Stand up, yeah, I can hear you, yeah. Even if you speak without a mic, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Hello, good evening.
I'm
Nitish.
Okay, then that's fine. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Nitish. I'm a research scholar at JNU. So my question is to Professor Jacob. Sir, what do you think of Bhanu Pratap Mehta's argument that India's idealistic posture was just a reflection of its lack of material capability or its weakness? Was that lack of strategic culture or just a brute reality of global distribution of power?
Okay, got your question. I'll take one more question. Here, yes, sir, could you stand up? Yeah, there, yeah. Okay, we'll take the last one there. Stand up also, you come
My
on
question to General Shukla. He said that positioning of instrument, his talk is majorly focused on the defense expenditure. But is there, our government must focus on the R&D because it is very low expending on the research and development. If we compare to the other nation states like South Korea, Japan, these are the small states, but their R&D are more. But again, I'm asking to sir, why the government is not focusing on such issues?
Okay. Sorry, I'm going to make an exception just for that last question then. Yes. Please.
Thank you. My name is Yasuyuki Ishida from Japan. I'd like to express my Japanese point of view. And first, I have one comment and one question. It's nice to know that today you discuss about Taiwan Strait issues and the past island chain. I think several Indian scholars said India doesn't care much about Taiwan Strait crisis, so it's very important for Indian national interests as well. So it affects Asian balance for power. So Taiwan issue is very important. And my question is about Japan's role. Today you don't talk much about. And I think Abe Shinzo passed away and Japan's presence are declining so far. But now, as you know, Prime Minister Takaichi won a landslide victory. So I think Japan's role will change in international politics and Asian balance for power. Okay. So this is my question.
Thank you. Quick responses to that. Do you need me to recap? You want to go with Japan's role?
I'll take the JNU question and the
You'll
Japan
take the
role.
JNU question, okay. Go for it.
Big question. But I'm really happy that you read Bhanu Mehta's article, Still Under Nehru's Shadow, very carefully. Yes, he does make the argument that India's underbalancing is a function of its incapacity, but I also think that it's an incapacity plus mindset. It's not just incapacity. It's also, as we just detailed earlier, on the Japan question. So it's a when I look at the Indo-Pacific, and if you were to take the United States of America out of the Indo-Pacific, the most consequential Indian partner in the Indo-Pacific is Japan. There's no doubt in my mind about that. On Taiwan, I will sort of defer to the general here. So.
Okay. General.
So I'll skip Taiwan and I'll focus. No, I think that's an important question. Can I just finish it off?
Yes, please.
This instrument of force, since we began with Prime Minister Nehru, it is also a fact that after the 62 debacle, he called one General SPS Thorat. Thorat had warned the establishment about, China, and his voice was not heard. Prime Minister Nehru was graceful enough to call him. There was a lengthy conversation in which he regretted many of the things that he had done. And so as to, some kind of compensate him, he appointed him somewhere, I think, Maharashtra Public Service Commission or something. But the more important issue is, that conversation tells you that perhaps Prime Minister Nehru regretted the skewed positioning of the instrument of force, and if he had lived longer, our national security reforms would have come faster. But anyway, that's history. What happened thereafter is, my point is that let me just point out to you the threat calculus. There's China in the north, Western horizons, Pakistan, Turkey, Falana, Dhimkana, Bangladesh, Myanmar, IOR. In such a grim threat calculus, naturally the instrument of force should be central. We have been resourcing our instrument of force intermittently, not in a constant manner. Now, just 30 seconds more, 2014, we've begun another national security makeover. I know how we fought for CDS DMA. It was a bitter fight. Atmanirbharta in defense, private sector. Today you have deal after deal. Adani helicopters, some startups taking data centers to space. Unheard of. Atmanirbharta in defense, private sector startups. Defense coming out of the shadows of foreign policy, so on and so forth. But given the China threat and the other threats, we need to do far more. Okay. And resource our instrument of force, not just with money, but with wisdom.
Okay, last word to you, Ambassador Singh.
I think the questions have been answered.
But if you just want a closing comment on anything you've heard. All right, I think without necessarily a consensus, but some broad contours of agreement, we'll get Raja Mohan back on stage.
Thank you, Barka. I think we've already late, so I'm not going to take much time. And thank you for all staying back and with great patience. So I'll just say a few things. One, as you said, what we've had today is a debate. Unfortunately, we don't have too much of informed debate. Either it gets partisan mudslinging at each other, or too much of consensus. Some consensus is good, but too much of consensus is actually a bad thing because it leads to stagnation and not enough questioning of our own propositions, which we need to do. So I think to that extent, I think we've had really a wonderful evening. Second, I think is on what Ambassador Shamsaran talked about, the gap between discourse analysis and the practice. That we need to do more empirical studies. I see all the young scholars here from JNU, and maybe other universities as well, that we got to do more empirical studies and not just, it's also important to follow discourse analysis. Shamsaran was absolutely right when he said, look, the nuclear deal was a strategic construct. But you saw how much difficulty the government had, the UPA government had. It was deeply divided. The Congress party was divided. The bureaucracy was divided. So while you had the vanguard, say, Shamsaran, Ronan Sen, and Jaishankar pushing the deal, the internal resistance to the deal, that's what the unwillingness to think it in terms of balance of power or strategically led to what nearly fall of the government, the no confidence motion, all the chaos of 2007-8 that we saw. So therefore, it's important to follow all these elements. Barka said, look, it's a Darwinian world. I don't think it ever disappeared. I'm sure my younger colleagues will say, look, it is in the end an anarchic system. While you can dress it up once in a while, there might be good phases like in the 90s. But in the end, it's always a system of anarchy in which each state is for itself and that it needs to manage. On the US question, I would say US is a tough love. It's not like dealing with CCP, one guy is always a standard formulation, or the Communist Party or Soviet Union or Russia, where you get this G to G interaction of a fairly simplistic, easy to deal with one actor. But in the US, I think the president can be a crazy guy. There is Congress, there is system. So I would say that's where working with the multiple internal actors becomes very, very important, and I think we are not unaware of that. We're going to see the midterm elections going to come. Indians are going to play a role in that. So I would say not to let Trump derail us too much, and as Arun said, there are ways in which you can deal with American capital, American political class, and the divisions. So there again, the complexity is what we need to do. And finally, on balance, I think the point about what Pratap was saying, look, you take the case of China. In China in 71 was a deep internal crisis. The follow-up or the collapse of the domestic structures thanks to the Cultural Revolution, internal fights within the party. But then here is Mao Zedong placed the US card against Russia. With really nothing, $300 per capita income, a country at civil war, you can still play a balancing game. What the real world gives you is you got to play with what you have. That you got to balance with what you have and not saying, I don't have enough cards, therefore I don't balance. And I think states do use what they have. And I think we have enough to play that card. I think India is the 4 trillion economy. We got many more cards, I think, today. And that we can do that through, as all the panelists said, diversification, internal self-strengthening, modernization. These are the key. And I think the more we do it, the better we'll be able to handle the external situation. I want to thank you all and thank the panel for being a wonderful.
Thank you.
Well, it's my job to deliver the vote of thanks. So thank you all for coming today, beating the traffic and being here and for listening to all of us. But I must also thank Barkha for curating a wonderful discussion, Ambassador Saran for delivering his keynote. And I think I must also thank Professor Raja. Now I will just take 2 or 3 minutes, or maybe less, just 2 points. One is to compliment him on his analytical method, which I feel is sort of a lighthouse for especially the young scholars in the room, bringing in the importance of history in foreign policy analysis. And I say that because what we see today is that the world is moving too fast, and the news of the world is moving too fast, moving even faster. And I think what impact that has on foreign policy analysis is that we almost treat it as under 10 minutes delivery. Amazon Prime Now. Unfortunately, I think what that does is that we seek answers. But as Professor Raja's work shows and his comments also, analysis is about asking questions through your analysis, during your analysis, and even after your analysis. And I think that's also important vis-a-vis history, because what I see these days is that we go to history looking for answers. And the nature of history is such that you will always find what you're looking for. But I think what he does is he goes to history with questions, and I think that's where his sort of method is so good. And just to quote Mark Trachtenberg when he says, by studying history, the scholar can develop the kind of sensibility that makes intelligent judgment possible. And that's what I read in his columns. So I think that's very, very important. The second quick point is on the pace, which is more of a complaint. In the last 7 days, you've published 5 articles, and then there's a book. Please, sir, go for vacation, leave something for us. Right? So, but with that, thank you so much for coming, and we hope that you have enjoyed today's discussion, and you keep coming for our events as well as India's world events. Thank you. Good night.
Thank you.